In 1950, two brothers cutting peat in a Danish bog uncovered a man's face in the mud, so fresh, so intact, that they called the police to report a murder. They were right about the murder. They were wrong about the date. The man in the bog had been killed around 2,400 years ago, and he was not alone. Across the bogs of northern Europe, hundreds of bodies have come out of the peat, skin intact, faces calm, stubble on their chins, eyelashes in place. And nearly every one of them died violently. Hanged. Throats cut, struck down, then placed carefully in the water. These are the bog bodies, the best preserved ancient people in Europe, and its oldest unsolved murders. Tonight, how a swamp can keep a human face for 2,000 years, the individual victims, and how each of them died, and the dark question underneath it all: who was killing these people, and why. To understand the bodies, you first have to understand the bogs, because what they do to the dead is very close to magic, and it's pure chemistry. Across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, and Ireland lie thousands of peat bogs, cold, still, waterlogged expanses of moss built up over thousands of years. For centuries, local people have cut and dried the peat as fuel. And every so often, a spade strikes something that should not be there. Here is why. A raised bog is an environment unlike almost any other on Earth. The water is cold, highly acidic, and this is the crucial part, almost completely without oxygen. The bacteria that break down a body cannot live in it. And the sphagnum moss that forms the bog releases compounds that act, in effect, like a natural tanning agent, the same chemical family used to tan leather. So when a body goes into a bog, something extraordinary happens. Instead of decaying, it is tanned. The skin darkens to deep brown or black and turns to something like leather, but it keeps its form. The face keeps its features. Hair survives, though the bog acids often dye it red. Fingernails survive. Stomach contents survive. Even the delicate stubble on a man's chin can survive. What the bog takes, strangely, is the bones. The acid slowly dissolves the skeleton. So some bog bodies are, in essence, a preserved skin and soft tissue draped around a softened frame. The bog keeps the person and dissolves the scaffolding. The result is preservation so intimate, it is genuinely unsettling. These are not skeletons or dried husks. These are faces. Expressions. People you feel you could wake. And if this is your kind of story, real bodies, real forensics, real ancient mysteries, take 1 second and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel, and there's a lot more coming. Now, let's meet the most famous man ever pulled from a bog. Because the man those Danish brothers found in 1950 is, quite possibly, the most hauntingly preserved ancient human being on Earth. He is called Tollund Man, after the area near Silkeborg, in Denmark's Jutland Peninsula, where he was found. The brothers cutting peat that spring day uncovered him lying curled on his side, about 7 feet down in the bog, in a sleeping position. His face was so lifelike, eyes gently closed, lips softly pressed, the expression utterly peaceful, that the finders assumed he was a recent murder victim and contacted the authorities. A local schoolboy had recently gone missing. Some feared this was him. It took archaeologists to reveal the truth. The man in the bog had died in the Iron Age, sometime around 400 BC, roughly 2,400 years ago. He was older than the Roman Empire, and the bog had kept him almost perfectly. Stand before him today, he's displayed at the Silkeborg Museum, and the details are almost too much. The stubble on his chin and upper lip, still visible. The wrinkles of his forehead, his eyelashes. He wears a pointed cap of sheepskin and wool, fastened under his chin with a hide strap, and a smooth hide belt at his waist. Otherwise, he was placed in the bog naked. He was around 40 years old, small by modern standards, and his expression is so serene that nearly everyone who sees him uses the same word. He looks asleep. And then your eye travels down from that peaceful face, and you see it. Around his neck, drawn tight, is a noose, a rope of plaited animal hide. its long end trailing down his back. Tollund Man did not lie down and die in that bog. He was hanged. The forensic examination confirmed it. And then, after death, someone took him down, closed his eyes, arranged his body carefully in a sleeping position, and laid him in the bog gently, by every indication. Killed with a rope, and then treated with what looks unmistakably like care, even tenderness. Science has even recovered his final hours. His stomach contained his last meal, a simple porridge of barley and seeds, including wild seeds gathered from the landscape, a humble, frugal gruel, eaten somewhere between 12 and 24 hours before he died. Researchers who reanalyzed it in recent years looked specifically for anything unusual, intoxicants, hallucinogens, painkillers, anything to suggest a special ritual meal or a drugged victim. They found essentially none, just porridge, an ordinary meal, and then a rope. A man eats breakfast. Within a day, he is hanged, arranged like a sleeper, and given to the bog. That is the puzzle of Tollund Man in miniature, violence and care in the same act. And he is only the beginning, because once you look past Tollund Man, you find the bogs of Europe have been giving up bodies for centuries, and the same dark pattern repeats again and again. Just a few miles from Tollund, and 2 years after him, peat cutters found Grauballe Man, and he tells a far more violent story. He died around 300 BC, a young man in his late 20s or early 30s, with, thanks to the bog acids, a shock of vivid red hair. His preservation is so complete that his hands could be fingerprinted more than 2,000 years after his death. His fingertips are as readable as yours. But there is nothing peaceful about how he died. Grauballe Man's throat was cut, one deep, decisive slash running virtually from ear to ear. This was not battle. The angle and depth suggest his head may have been pulled back, the cut delivered deliberately. He, too, had eaten a last meal of grain porridge, an odd one, containing well over 60 different kinds of seeds and plants, as if assembled from the whole surrounding landscape. And in his gut were traces of ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on grain and can cause convulsions and hallucinations. Whether that ergot was deliberate, a drug given to a sacrificial victim, or just the accidental contamination of Iron Age grain, no one can say for certain. In the same bog where Tollund Man lay 12 years before his discovery, workers had found a woman, Elling woman, her long hair preserved and tied in an elaborate braid nearly a meter long. She, too, had been hanged. The mark of the rope was still on her neck. 2 hanged people, placed in the same small bog, perhaps within a generation of one another. That is not coincidence. That is a place being used repeatedly for the same grim purpose. Then, in 1984, the pattern surfaced far from Denmark. A commercial peat cutter in Cheshire, England, spotted what he thought was a piece of wood on his conveyor. It was a human foot. Archaeologists recovered the remains of a man now known as Lindow Man, who died around 2,000 years ago. And his death was the most violent of all. The examination found he had been struck savagely on the head, and there is evidence pointing to further violence, including a cut to the throat and possibly a cord at his neck. Some researchers read his injuries as a brutal, layered killing. Others caution that the bog and the excavation may account for some of the damage. Either way, this well-groomed young man, his beard and mustache neatly trimmed, his fingernails manicured, a man who clearly did not do rough manual labor, met an extremely violent end and was placed face down in a pool in the bog. In his gut, along with a last meal of charred bread, were grains of mistletoe pollen, a plant with deep ritual significance in Celtic tradition, though the amount was small enough that scientists debate whether it means anything at all, and the bogs keep complicating the story. One famous body from Germany, long known as Windy Girl, a slight figure with what looked like long hair, romantically imagined for decades as a young woman punished, perhaps, for some transgression, was re-examined with modern DNA and bone analysis. Windy Girl turned out to be a boy, an undernourished young male. An entire tragic story that generations had told about this body, a story of a shamed girl evaporated under the science. The bogs preserve bodies perfectly. Our interpretations of them, it turns out, preserve our own assumptions just as well. Across Denmark alone, more than 500 bog bodies and bog skeletons have been recorded from the Iron Age. Across Northern Europe, the count of well-preserved bodies runs into the hundreds. And among the well-studied bodies, the recurring theme is unmistakable: violent death, hanging, strangulation, cut throats, blows, followed by deliberate placement in a bog. Not battlefield dead, not accident victims, killed and then placed. And in Ireland, in a single remarkable year, the bogs offered up two bodies that may hold a key to the whole mystery. In 2003, within months of each other, two ancient men emerged from Irish bogs about 25 miles apart. The first, called Tollund Man, was a young man with a striking feature. His hair was styled upward, held in place with an imported pine resin gel, a kind of Iron Age hair product that would have come from continental Europe, an expensive luxury. The second, Old Tollund Man, was physically extraordinary. Estimates from his arm span suggest he may have stood well over 6 feet tall, a giant for his time. His hands were soft and beautifully manicured, like Lindow Man in England. This was no laborer. His last meal was humble cereals and buttermilk, but chemical analysis of his nails showed that in the months before death he had eaten a meat-rich diet. He had lived, in short, like an aristocrat. Both men died horrifically, stabbed, struck, mutilated in ways I'll spare you the full details of, and both were placed in their bogs with apparent deliberation. Old Tollund Man's arms had been threaded through with bands of hazel, restrained or ritually bound even in death. And here's what made these two bodies so important. Researchers at the National Museum of Ireland noticed something about where they lay. Both bogs sat on ancient tribal boundaries and near hills associated with the ancient ceremonies in which Irish kings were crowned. That alignment inspired a compelling theory that some bog bodies were kings or would-be kings or royal hostages, high-status men sacrificed when things went wrong. In early Irish tradition, the king was symbolically wedded to the land and its goddess. The fertility of the soil and the fortune of the tribe were bound up in his person. If the harvests failed, if famine or defeat came, the contract had failed, and the theory holds that the king himself could be the price, killed, and given to the goddess in the bog, at the boundary of the territory he had failed. The soft hands, the imported hair gel, the meat-rich diets, the deliberate placement at borders, the profile fits men of the highest rank, not criminals or slaves. It is only a theory, and it cannot explain every body in every bog across Northern Europe. But it adds a third possibility to our question, and maybe the most haunting one of all, that some of these people were not the lowest members of their societies, but the very highest, rulers who paid for famine with their lives. So we arrive at the real question in full: sacrifices, criminals or fallen kings, who was going into the bogs and why. Here is where the bog bodies stop being a preservation marvel and become one of archaeology's most unsettling debates. Because there are two main explanations, and both of them are dark. The first, and the most widely held, is human sacrifice. The Iron Age peoples of Northern Europe left no writing of their own, but everything we can reconstruct suggests that bogs and wetlands were sacred to them, liminal places, neither solid land nor open water, where the boundary between the human world and the world of the gods grew thin. We know they gave the bogs offerings. Archaeologists have recovered swords, shields, cauldrons, ornaments, butter, even great war trophies, deliberately sunk into the water as gifts to the divine. The bogs were, in effect, altars, and the bodies fit the pattern of offerings. Consider the strange details. Tollund Man, killed by hanging but then arranged with apparent tenderness, eyes closed, laid as if sleeping. Victims of mere execution are rarely treated with such care. The last meals of plain seed-laden porridge, eaten in winter or early spring, perhaps a ritual meal before a sacrifice timed to the hungriest season, when a community might beg its gods for the return of spring and a good harvest. A Roman historian, Tacitus, writing about the Germanic tribes in the 1st century, described peoples who worshipped an earth goddess and drowned slaves in sacred lakes as part of her rites, a chilling outside glimpse of exactly the kind of practice the bogs seem to record. In this reading, the bog people were chosen, whether honored, coerced, or condemned, and given to the gods in the water, their bodies held forever in the sacred ground that received them. But there is a second explanation, and Tacitus himself supplies it. He also wrote that among these tribes, certain criminals and social outcasts, deserters, the disgraced, were punished by being pressed down into bogs and marshes. In this reading, some of the bog people are not offerings but executions, criminals, traitors, the shamed, disposed of in the wet wasteland outside the community, in the place where such people belonged. Some bodies were pinned down in the bog with stakes and branches, which you can read as ritual or as making very sure the dead stayed where they were put. So which is it? The honest answer, and it's the answer the leading researchers themselves give, is that we cannot always tell, and it may well be both. A sacrifice and an execution can even be the same event, a condemned person offered to the gods. The truth is that each body is its own cold case, with its own evidence, and the motive behind Iron Age killings is the one thing the bog could not preserve. The chemistry kept their faces, their meals, their ropes and wounds. It could not keep the why. One more thing science has taught us here, a lesson in humility. Grauballe man was long thought to have suffered a skull fracture and a broken leg, evidence, it seemed, of torture, of a frenzied multi-stage killing. Modern CT scanning revealed those injuries almost certainly happened after death, the crushing weight of the peat, and damage during excavation. The savage overkill story softened under better science into a single cause of death. The bodies have not changed in 2,000 years. But our reading of them changes decade by decade, and more than once, the dramatic story has turned out to be partly our own invention. There is a reason the bog bodies unsettle people in a way that skeletons and mummies in golden masks do not. A skeleton is anonymous. A pharaoh in a sarcophagus is distant, wrapped in ritual and gold. But Tollund Man has stubble. Elling woman has a braid someone plaited for her. Lindow man trimmed his beard. Grauballe man has fingerprints. These are not relics. They are faces so specific, so individual, that standing before them collapses 2,000 years into nothing. The museum curator who studies Tollund Man says that seeing him is like standing face to face with a person from the past. And it is. That's exactly what it is. And every one of those faces belongs to someone who died at the hands of other people, hanged, cut, struck down, and given to the water by a community whose reasons died with them. Perhaps they were offerings sent to the gods in the hungry end of winter. Perhaps they were the condemned, pressed into the mire. Perhaps for some, both at once. The bog kept everything except the answer. But it kept them. Ordinary Iron Age people, not kings, not conquerors, just men and women with worn hands and simple last meals, who should have vanished utterly, and instead became the most present, most human ancient people we have. Their killers are dust. The gods they may have been given to are forgotten, and the victims are still here, sleeping in glass cases with their eyes closed, waiting out the centuries with the patience of the bog itself. Whoever they were, whatever was done to them, and why they were not erased, the water remembered them. If this story stayed with you the way it stays with me, leave a comment, sacrifice, punishment, or a fallen king. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more preserved faces, cold cases, and ancient mysteries still waiting in the dark.